A common myth in spirituality is that the senses cannot be trusted, that we're so tempted to grasp at and desire what our senses show us, that we're unable to find our center, unable to calm our spirit, our mind, and our body. And this is why we don't know our true nature, why we suffer. But this isn't quite right. It's a practical view for starting out the spiritual path. It has some truth to it, but in my opinion, there's no reason to form an incorrect view because it has practical implications at first, and then have to eradicate the view later. So why not just start out with a more accurate view? The truth of it is, what distorts our perceptions, what keeps us struggling, what keeps us in desire and aversion, in distraction, in delusion, ignorance, and suffering, isn't what's directly available in the sense fields. It's the overlay over that which we sense, that we're constantly reacting to, relating to, taking our cues from, that make the world appear to be divided, that makes it appear as if we need to continue to struggle to try to straighten out our lives, to try to make ourselves feel satisfied, that we have to constantly seek a better way of thinking, feeling, and believing. This endless struggle and seeking is not a fault of the sounds. It's not the fault of the visual field, the forms, shapes, images, colors. It's not the fault of the sensations in the body. Ultimately, it's the fault of perception. It's the fault of misperception. It's the fault of erroneous views. So why is it helpful sometimes to believe that the senses are not to be trusted when we start out? Well, because the first movement of realization, which I call first awakening typically, requires us to close the sense gates, requires us to turn our attention inward, to take the backward step into our conscious identity, into our identity as consciousness. It requires us to let go of the polarities that are constantly being perpetuated by gross thought. We often do this through self-inquiry. When we learn to turn our attention back to its source, when we learn to just rest in the pure knowing, or the pure sense of being aware, or the pure sense of awareness or conscious awareness, the labels don't matter. The act matters. The act of resting inwardly. When we do this, we are closing the sense gates. We're focusing our attention in the conscious space itself. This space of what we take ourselves to be before we start taking ourselves to be something specific. So we're learning to retract our attention from polarized consciousness, from the standing wave of self and other in consciousness, or me and my problems and the world external that seems to exist in consciousness, back to the source, which is just consciousness. This consciousness has no boundaries. Any thought can arise in consciousness, but it doesn't change the nature of consciousness, just as the rising wave in the ocean doesn't change the nature of water or of the ocean. So when we're able to do this, get to the root of the experience of I, or the experience of being, or the experience of being you, and rest in that root long enough, and not allow thoughts and beliefs and identities to carry the mind down the river, but just remain there, then at some point a significant shift in our identity will occur, a transformation in what we take ourselves to be. And from there, we're largely free of the gross thoughts. We're largely free of the identity with thought as such. This feels like quite a release. Changes the way you experience yourself. It changes the way you experience life and the environment. Changes the way you experience thought and emotion. Now from here, either through intentional work or spontaneously, you will begin to investigate the nature of subtle thought, not gross thought, but subtle thought, which are perceptual filters. These are what overlay the senses that make things appear as they are not. These subtle thought forms, or subtle tendencies to contract, or the mechanisms of selfing, these are what cause us to struggle. These are what cause suffering. But because they're so subtle, they seem continuous with the sense fields. So this next area of work, this deeper stage realization work, is about separating those out. And this can be completely overlooked. It's very easy to miss this. But if you start to investigate, you'll start to see what it is to hear without a hearer, what it is to see without a seer, what it is to feel and move without a feeler, without a mover. As that happens and these more subtle perceptual filters dissolve, and with them, the boundaries that make reality appear to be divided up also dissolve. Finally, you can rest as life itself. And your portals to that are the sense gates. So here it's very clear that there's nothing intrinsically wrong with the senses. Desire and aversion are not intrinsic to hearing, seeing, tasting, touching, smelling. Subject, object are not intrinsic to sight, smell, taste, touch. Now, the sum total of all of these perceptual filters, including gross thought, which is disidentified from in the initial movement of realization, and the subtle thought forms, thought filters, that are dissolved sometimes slowly and sometimes quickly after a time, could be called the self, or the illusion of self, or the illusion of the separate self, and all of its components: the relational self, the struggling self, the reactive self, the seeming separate self, the self in space and the self in time, and the view-forming and frame-forming self. None of those actually exist, but those tendencies, those movements in thought consciousness, make it appear so. Beyond these perceptual filters, things get incredibly simple. Spontaneity is the natural way. You don't have to meditate to know it. Non-dual experience is baseline. It's always there. It's just how it is. And it becomes exquisitely obvious that the root cause of delusion, suffering, struggle, and ignorance, which is avoidance of the truth of things just as they are, is the illusion of self. Now, this might sound heavy, cumbersome, complicated, but it's not. It's very simple. This truth is something we all know at some level. It's your true nature. It's not something you have to figure out, per se. It's more a matter of looking very, very closely at what's actually happening. Looking very closely at the nature of perception. Looking very closely at the nature of thought, consciousness, the sense of I. Looking closely at the experience of an emotion. Listening closely to what a sound actually is, to what hearing actually is. Feeling the depth of experience here and now, and becoming exquisitely clear about whether that's a distinct phenomenon, whether it comes or goes, whether it has boundaries, whether it has a beginning or an end, whether it has solidity or substance, whether there's anything that relates to it or perceives it or is aware of it. So this all becomes about clear seeing in the end. What's required is a willingness to be ruthlessly honest with yourself, with your experience, and just take it all the way down until there's nothing left but reality, just as it is, real and unreal, formed and formless, this moment only, and eternal, distinct and indistinct,